After a speech he gave at the Manhattan Center in New York City on December 1st, 1963, Malcolm X was asked by reporters for his thoughts on the recent assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had been tragically gunned down in his motorcade while visiting Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, so the death of the president was still an open wound for the nation. Malcolm's controversial statement not only made him a notorious figure in the media, but even got him in trouble with his leader, Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam. Indeed, Malcolm's response marked the public beginning of the end of his leadership in the pseudo-Islamic cult known to the press as the Black Muslims. When asked about the Kennedy assassination, Malcolm declared that it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. He had been a farm boy, Malcolm added, and the chickens coming home to roost at the end of the day never made him sad. These remarks were quickly picked up by newspapers and television reports throughout the country, igniting a firestorm of bad press for the Nation of Islam and resulted in Malcolm being silenced. Of course, as history shows, however, Malcolm had envious and hateful enemies within the Nation of Islam already, so this was all they needed to finally get him out from his influential place in the Nation of Islam. The rationale for Malcolm's apparently insensitive remarks, however, should not be forgotten because they have continuing relevance in our society. When I learned today about the tragic assassination or murder of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk, it was not long before I heard Malcolm poetically speaking inside my head, reminding me of the chickens coming home to roost. Now, before anyone jumps to the wrong conclusions, I decry and lament Kirk's death. He was someone's son, someone's husband, and someone's father. I may have disagreed with him on key points, but I could agree with him too, or at least appreciate the fact that he was playing the inevitable conservative yin to the yang of postmodernity's more insane aspects. I'm a Christian, and so I'm not entirely conservative or liberal, and no Christian should be. And even if, as the saying goes, a broken clock can be right twice a day, I would never say Kirk was literally always wrong, even if I think he was wrong almost all the time. I didn't know Charlie Kirk, didn't admire him, and wouldn't consider him a person to emulate. But I'd rather he be alive tonight with his wife and children at home rather than lying quietly in a mortuary refrigeration unit. Having said that, however, I'd like to point out that Malcolm X, who was himself murdered by his own former organization at the command of his own former leader 2 years later, had a point about Kennedy's assassination and the chickens coming home to roost. It's a point that was true then, and it's still true now. When Malcolm X said that JFK's death was another case of the chickens coming home to roost, he was saying that in the context of the public statements and criticisms he had made toward the United States government's foreign policy in the same speech. Malcolm was way ahead of most of his generation in recognizing that U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia was wrong, and that it was a governmental campaign of widespread violence that was completely unwarranted, no matter what the Democrats and Republicans at that time may have claimed. Malcolm was right. In those days, the U.S. was overtly and covertly involved in disruptions and wars and support of wars around the world. The U.S. was exporting violence to other people's homes, Malcolm was saying, and the fact that our violence reached back home to the United States and took our president was no surprise. In fact, it was kind of a vindication of Malcolm's early condemnation of the U.S. invasion of Southeast Asia, something that even Martin Luther King Jr. had not come around to for a few more years. To Malcolm X, Kennedy's death was no cause of rejoicing, but there was in that horrible spectacle the affirmation of his political rebuke to the nation. A nation that spreads violence abroad cannot expect to enjoy peace at home. It should go without saying that the USA is a violent nation. We have been a violent nation from our inception. We not only used violence to win our independence, but we immediately used violence to expand our territory and our wealth in conquest and enslavement. And it's no secret, too, that our nation's love of guns is deeply rooted in the history of slave patrols that suppressed African peoples by using violence and terrorism. The same peoples that then launched into a secession movement for the slave states only 85 years after independence. And after a national bloodletting that cost 600,000 lives, the United States put the Civil War behind and proceeded to launch ahead with further violence and expansion on the so-called frontier, and then established a policy of terror and violence called Jim Crow, which lasted for the most part until the 1960s. In that era, the 1960s, Malcolm's era, the racist violence of citizens and police was commonplace against black people. Civil rights workers were killed, and racist terrorism continued, even as U.S. agencies abroad worked to advance our interests, even at the cost of instigating and supporting violence and assassination. Malcolm X himself was outraged after the CIA instigated assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, in 1961. Lumumba's death was a tragedy, and this was only 2 years before JFK was killed. I'm afraid were Malcolm X still among us, he would probably be saying the same thing about the tragic killing of Charlie Kirk tonight. To be sure, Kirk was neither a president nor an elected official, but he was an influential political player. Not a few Christians will be offended because they want to present Kirk's death as a kind of Christian martyrdom, and I'm not saying that Kirk is not some kind of martyr for some kind of cause. I'm aware that he was a Christian believer, at least in a doctrinal sense, but so were many slaveholders and racist community leaders who perpetrated lynchings and segregation during Jim Crow. Charlie Kirk and I may have had similar doctrinal convictions about historic Christian creeds, but I would argue he was disconnected from the gospel in ways that stand out quite vividly. He was a white Christian nationalist for all intents and purposes. He defended the gun culture of the United States. He belittled and denied the historic claims of African Americans. He mocked any sort of federal measure to demand that a historically prejudiced and racist nation might sustain some measure of fairness. However, believe it or not, it's not Charlie Kirk who's on trial here. It's the United States of America that is on trial. It is this nation that has to foot the bill for Kirk's brutal and reprehensible assassination. The issue is not to indict Kirk. History has already judged him accordingly. Rather, it is a question of collective guilt. The USA is a nation weighted down and freighted with collective guilt. We are seeping with the blood of crimes past, crimes we did not commit ourselves in this generation, but which we as a nation are unwilling to fully own. We are tainted by the guilt of our leaders, past and present, who thought they could say, "God bless America," while genociding their way from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the northern borders of Canada down to the so-called Gulf of America. More recently, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, our nation has carried on a genocidal war on the Palestinian people by a seemingly endless supply of bombs and weapons to our spoiled daughter, Israel. Men, women, and children, and babies too, have been dying almost nonstop for nearly 2 years, and our political leaders, from Joe Biden to Donald Trump, have allowed this evil to continue. The whole world has been watching the audacity of Israel's violent genocide, but the whole world knows full well that they are only perpetrating these crimes against humanity with the enablement and protection of our own political leaders. Our leaders, many of whom are being almost literally bought off by Israel, have turned a blind eye to the violence unleashed upon the Palestinian people. There is sufficient guilt to go around here, from Genocide Joe all the way over to Mr. Mediterranean Riviera Trump himself. To borrow a line from the Apostle Paul, quoting the Old Testament, "There is no one righteous, no, not one." Jesus warned the Israelite leaders of his day that they were the terminal generation. He told them flatly that all the murders and injustices of their forefathers were coming due on them. Now, I'm not comparing the USA to Israel in the Bible. I'm simply making a point about divine justice. God keeps an account of injustice. Often, God rolls over the crimes of one generation into another when the hearts of the children are no better than the hearts of their fathers and forefathers. Jesus criticized the hypocrisy of the Pharisees for decorating the tombs of the prophets after their own forefathers had killed those prophets. Jesus knew that if his contemporaries were alive in the days of those prophets, they too would have killed them. That's why justice finally broke loose on Jerusalem. Jesus was telling his contemporaries that the chickens were coming home to roost. But Jesus added that the bill wouldn't come due until they had finally killed the Prince of Peace, the Son of God, who had come as one last chance for Israel's redemption. And after they crucified Jesus, the leaders of Jerusalem had only about 40 years before judgment finally fell. The chickens finally came home to roost. Now, every wicked nation has its own chickens of judgment, but something about the United States which makes us kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde. We can talk about the evil side of this nation, but then we get rebuked by patriots and Christian nationalists and others who tell us only speak about what is good, about our greatness, who we are as a generous and law-abiding nation. But that doesn't change anything. And one by one, the chickens start coming home to roost. Today in Utah, one more chicken came home to roost. In the long run, it doesn't really matter if it was a Republican killed by a Democrat or if it was a Democrat attacked in his home by a Republican. The point is that our nation has an ample supply of violence, and today it was the right wing's turn to taste blood and death. The next time, it might be a liberal being gunned down like Gabby Giffords in 2011 in Arizona, who narrowly escaped, or the terrorist plot to kidnap the Democratic Michigan governor in 2020, or the attack on the husband of Nancy Pelosi, who was brutalized in his home in 2022, or the home of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, which was set on fire earlier this year. Any of these incidents might have turned into homicide at the hands of one or another miscreant. The point is, this is all American violence. This is what a violent nation acts like. We are not the noblest nation on earth. We are not the safest nation on earth. We are not the most God-fearing nation on earth. We are not holistically the most prosperous nation on earth. We are a nation of freedoms, yet beset by outrage, idolatrous individualism, crass materialism, demonic racism, ideological bondage of the left and of the right, and a circus of political leaders, right and left, who lie to us, who take bribes from special interests, and who sleep peacefully while babies are being bombed and buried under rubble, or starved while their fathers and brothers are shot down for standing in a food line. Charlie Kirk is dead. It's a damn shame. It's also another case of chickens coming home to roost. It's a sad, unhappy thing, to be sure, but if you can climb out of that hole you think is a point of observation and look through a more elevated and truthful lens, you may finally see the big picture, just like Malcolm X did.
Malcolm X, you were involved in a controversy some months ago with your leader. Is that over?
Well, I've been silent for the past 90 days because of some statements I made concerning the President of the United States, which were distorted.
They were distorted?
And yes.
What did you say, Malcolm?
Well, I said the same thing that everybody says, that his assassination was the result of the climate of hate. But only I said the chickens came home to roost, and which means the same thing. Climate of hate means that this is the result of something. And when I said chickens coming home to roost, I said the same thing.
But you did not say that you were glad the president was killed.
No, that's what the press said. What would I look like saying that I'm glad the president was killed?